The final nail in the coffin of her old life was not a nail at all, but the sharp, decisive click of a lawyer's briefcase. Elara stood in the cramped office, dust motes dancing in the single beam of afternoon sun, and watched her husband's brother, Silas, sign the last paper. It was done. The house she had shared with Thomas for 20 years, the thriving brickworks they had built from mud and sweat, the savings meant for their old age, all of it now belonged to Silas. A debt, he had called it. An old, unspoken loan between brothers, conveniently documented after Thomas was in the ground. Silas, a man whose hands had never known a callus, pushed a small stack of coins across the polished desk. "For your consideration, Elara," he said, his voice slick with false piety. "And of course, the deed." He slid a folded, yellowed paper after the coins. It was for the old North Kiln, a failed experiment of his and Thomas's father from half a century ago. A squat brick dome built into the wind-scoured face of North Ridge. Abandoned after its first firing cracked the flue. It was less than worthless. It was a monument to failure. The lawyer cleared his throat, avoiding her eyes. The whole town of Promise Creek knew what was happening. They saw the injustice, but Silas held the notes on the mercantile, the grist mill, and half the farms in the valley. To stand with Elara was to stand against the man who could ruin you. So they watched, and they whispered, and they did nothing. She counted the coins. $12. Enough for a stagecoach ticket to anywhere, with perhaps $1 left over. That was the price of her life's work. She looked at Silas, at his starched collar and clean fingernails, and saw not a man, but a ledger. Everything was a transaction. She picked up the coins and the deed, her knuckles white. She did not say thank you. She did not weep or rage. A silence settled in her so deep and cold it felt like permafrost. Outside, the town's pity was a suffocating blanket. Mr. Gable, the owner of the mercantile, tipped his hat. "A terrible business, Elara, truly. You'll be heading east, I imagine? There's work for a seamstress in Prosperity." He was offering her an escape, a way to disappear quietly and confirm to everyone that she was beaten, that this was the sensible, expected end. "I'll need an axe," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. "Your best felling axe, and a good file." Gable blinked. "An axe? For what?" "And 50 pounds of flour, 20 of salt pork, 10 of beans, a heavy wool blanket, all the seed packets you have for winter greens and roots, and a shovel." The word spread through Promise Creek faster than fire in a dry field. Elara was not leaving. She was going up to the old kiln. The whispers turned to murmurs of disbelief, then to outright mockery. To go to Northridge was to embrace death. The soil was stone and clay, the wind a constant knife, and the winters there were a special kind of cruel. The kiln itself was a ruin, a place for coyotes to den and for ghosts to settle. She ignored them. With her $12, she paid for her supplies. The coins barely covered it, but Gable, perhaps sensing some sliver of shame, let the last few cents go. She loaded everything onto a small handcart she bought for $0.10. As she stood in the center of the dusty street, ready to leave, Thomas's old dog, Boulder, a grizzled mastiff mix with one floppy ear, trotted out from behind the smithy and sat at her feet. He had been kicked out of the house by Silas's wife that morning. He looked up at Elara, his amber eyes steady, and she laid a hand on his broad head. He was all she had left of that life. He, the worthless deed, and the axe. She turned her back on the silent, watching faces of Promise Creek and began the long walk north. The journey to Northridge was a pilgrimage into purgatory. The dirt road dwindled to a cart track, then a game trail, Then nothing but rock and stubborn, low-lying scrub. The handcart, a flimsy thing of pine and iron, bucked and groaned over every stone. Ilara's muscles, accustomed to the rhythms of a home and garden, screamed in protest. The sun beat down, and the wind, a constant presence here, began its work, chapping her lips and whipping strands of hair across her face. Boulder scouted ahead, his heavy paws surprisingly nimble on the treacherous ground. He was her only companion, the only living thing that was not actively hostile or indifferent to her existence. The farther she walked from Promise Creek, the heavier the silence became, broken only by the scrape of the cart's wheels and the ceaseless sigh of the wind. The valley fell away behind her, a green and pleasant dream, replaced by a world of gray stone and pale, unforgiving sky. By late afternoon, she saw it, a dark, ugly hump on the hillside, like a boil on the skin of the earth. The abandoned kiln. From a distance it looked small and pathetic. As she drew closer, it grew into something more menacing. It was larger than she remembered, a squat dome of blackened brick, half swallowed by the hillside it was built into. The great arched opening gaped like a mouth, filled with shadows. A section of the roof had collapsed inward, and the chimney was a jagged stump of broken masonry. She unhitched the cart, her body trembling with an exhaustion so profound it felt like a sickness. She walked to the entrance and peered inside. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, rot, and old smoke. The floor was a jumble of fallen bricks, animal droppings, and wind-blown debris. Light struggled through the collapsed section of the roof, illuminating a scene of utter dereliction. This was her inheritance, a tomb. The full weight of her situation crashed down upon her. The town was right. Silas was right. This was a fool's errand. A slow, cold suicide. Her legs gave way, and she sank to her knees in the dust and debris just outside the entrance. The wind howled around the corner of the structure, a mocking, triumphant sound. Tears she had refused to shed in town now burned hot and useless on her cheeks. She was 40 years old, a widow with nothing but a broken-down oven on a God-forsaken hill. Despair, cold and absolute, wrapped around her heart. Boulder nudged her hand with his wet nose, whining softly. She leaned against his solid warmth, her brief storm of grief passing, leaving behind a hollow ache. She got to her feet, wiping her face with the back of her hand. Crying wouldn't make a roof. Despair wouldn't build a fire. She forced herself to move, to assess. The wind was relentless, a physical force that pushed and pulled and stole warmth. But as she stepped just inside the arched opening of the kiln, the wind died. The air became utterly still. It was still cold, but the biting edge was gone. She took another step into the darkness. It was like entering a different world. She ran her hand along the interior wall. The bricks were curved, expertly laid by a master mason, her husband's father. They were cool to the touch, but it was a neutral coolness, not the biting cold of the rock outside. She pressed deeper, her fingers finding the earth-packed wall behind the brick lining. It felt solid, immense. As she explored the cavernous space, moving toward the back where the kiln was buried deepest in the hill, she noticed the temperature changing again. It was subtle, a shift of only a few degrees, but undeniable. The air here was warmer, or, more accurately, it was less cold. It held a deep, resonant stability, a complete indifference to the howling wind outside. It was the hill itself, a colossal mass of earth and stone, acting as a buffer against the world. Then she heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound. Drip, drip, drip. Following the sound to the deepest, darkest corner of the kiln, she found a narrow seam in the rock face that the kiln had been built against. From it, a tiny, steady trickle of water ran down the stone, clear and pure, collecting in a small puddle on the clay floor. She touched a finger to the water. It was shockingly cold, but it was water. A constant, reliable source, protected from the freezing winds and the summer sun. Thermal mass. A spring. The worthless place had two secrets. The despair in her chest did not vanish, but it made room for something else. Something hard and sharp and resolute. A plan began to form, not from hope, but from sheer, stubborn necessity. She was still here. The hill was still here. And the work was waiting. The first week was a blur of brutal, mind-numbing labor. Her world shrank to the simple, agonizing physics of leverage and mass. Her first task was to clear the interior. She used the new shovel to heave fallen bricks, dirt, and years of accumulated refuse out of the kiln's mouth. Her hands, softened by years of kneading dough and tending a garden, blistered on the first day. By the third, the blisters had broken, leaving raw, weeping patches of skin that seared with pain every time she gripped the shovel's handle. She wrapped them in strips torn from her spare petticoat and kept working. She separated the debris into piles, whole bricks, broken bricks, stones, and usable soil. The whole bricks were a treasure. Each one was heavy, solid, a building block for her future. She stacked them carefully, a growing wall of potential. The stones she rolled to one side, destined to become the foundation for a new front wall. Her muscles screamed, her back felt as if it might snap in two, but every shovelful, every lifted stone, was a small act of defiance. Once the interior was cleared, she had a vast, domed space, roughly circular and 20 feet across. The floor was hard-packed clay. The walls were soot-blackened brick. The hole in the roof gaped at the sky, a constant reminder of the structure's vulnerability. That was the next task. Using the fallen timber from the surrounding scrubland, stunted, hardy pines that clung to the rocky soil, she built a crude frame over the hole. Then, using a mixture of the clay from the floor, water from the seep, and dried grasses for binder, she made a thick, heavy mortar. She filled the gaps in the timber frame with broken bricks and stones, slathering the whole thing with her primitive cement. It was ugly, heavy work, but when the first rain came, a cold, driving sleet, she stood inside and watched with grim satisfaction as her patch held. Not a single drop came through. Now she turned her attention to the great, gaping mouth of the kiln. It faced west, directly into the prevailing wind. It had to be sealed. Using the largest stone she could move as a foundation, she began to build a wall across the opening, leaving a space for a door and a small, high window. Lifting the stones into place was the hardest work she had ever done. She used logs as levers and rollers, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her vision sometimes graying out at the edges from the strain. After the stone foundation, she began laying the salvaged bricks. Her mortar was crude, but it worked. Slowly, painstakingly, a wall rose. She built a smaller, more efficient fireplace and chimney inside the kiln's original, massive firebox, venting it through a natural fissure in the rock she had cleared and widened. The first fire was a momentous occasion. She struck a match from her dwindling supply and held it to the kindling. Smoke puffed out. Then, as the draft caught, it drew cleanly up the new flue. A steady, controlled burn. Heat began to radiate into the space. She sat on the clay floor, boulder curled beside her, and watched the flames dance. It was the first time she had felt truly warm since Thomas died. The fire fought back the chill, but it was the walls that held the victory. The immense mass of brick and earth began to soak up the heat, a slow and steady process. She knew that long after the fire died to embers, the walls would continue to radiate that warmth back to her, a gentle, persistent embrace. She channeled the water from the seep into a cistern she dug into the floor and lined with puddled clay, fired hard with embers from her new hearth. It held over 100 gallons of fresh, clear water, a reservoir of life. In the back of the kiln, where the light was dim but the temperature was most stable, she built raised garden beds from salvaged planks and stones. Over 2 weeks, she hauled soil in her handcart from a small, fertile hollow she had discovered a half-mile down the ridge. It was back-breaking, repetitive work. But when the beds were full, she planted her seeds: kale, chard, carrots, turnips. A garden in the dark, a mad and desperate hope for green things in a world of stone. After 2 months of relentless toil, she made her one and only trip back to Promise Creek. She walked into town not as a pitiable widow, but as something else entirely. Her face was tanned and weathered, her hands were calloused and strong, and her eyes held a new, unsettling stillness. She walked with a purpose that made people step aside. She went directly to the mercantile. Mr. Gable stopped polishing the counter when she entered. He stared at her hands, her worn dress, the dirt smudged on her cheek. "Ilara, you're alive. I need 2 laying hens and a rooster, and a piglet, the smallest you have." A few customers who had been pretending to inspect bolts of cloth turned to stare openly. Gable let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Chickens? A pig? Good Lord, woman, where are you keeping them? In the oven with you?" The mockery was open now, sharp and public. "Are you going to cook them with kindling or just the winter wind?" someone called from the back. Ilara did not flinch. She placed her remaining money on the counter. It was money she had earned by selling a few well-made pine-pitch torches to a trapper she'd met on the ridge. "I have the money," she said, her voice even. The journey back up the ridge, with a squawking crate of chickens and a squealing piglet in her handcart, was a spectacle of absurdity. She was the madwoman of North Ridge, a cautionary tale whispered over dinner tables. They gave her a name then, a joke that everyone in Promise Creek shared: the Cinder Witch. It was a name meant to strip her of her dignity, to turn her into a creature of folklore, a harmless eccentric doomed to freeze or starve come first snow. She didn't care. She was no longer a part of their world. She had her own. She built a small, sturdy lean-to against the south-facing side of the kiln, insulated with sod and connected to the main chamber by a small door. Here, her animals would be protected from the wind and share in the structure's deep, abiding warmth. The chickens began to lay eggs within a week, small miracles of protein and fat. The piglet, whom she named Cinder, began to root happily in the pen she built for it. Her companion through all of this was Boulder. The dog was a silent witness to her struggles and her small triumphs. He stood guard while she worked, his low growl the only warning she needed of a passing coyote or a curious bear. At night, he slept at the foot of her cot, his solid weight a comfort against the vast, crushing loneliness of the wilderness. He was her shadow, her sentinel, her entire family. When the solitude felt too heavy to bear, she would talk to him, her voice a low murmur against the steady thrum of the wind outside her sealed door. He would watch her with his intelligent eyes, thumping his tail against the clay floor, a silent, unwavering affirmation that she was not, in fact, completely alone. Autumn deepened, the days growing short and sharp. The wind carried the first scent of snow, and in Promise Creek, the talk around the pot-bellied stove in Gable's mercantile often turned to the Cinder Witch. Silas, her brother-in-law, would hold court, shaking his head with a performative sadness. "Grief can do terrible things to the mind," he'd say. "I offered her a place. She chose that." The consensus was that she would be found in the spring, a frozen statue in her crumbling kiln. Her folly was a communal story, a dark piece of entertainment to pass the time before winter locked them all down. A hunter named Brant, a man known for his bluster, made a trip up the ridge out of spiteful curiosity. He found her splitting wood, the rhythmic crack of her axe echoing in the cold air. He saw the walled-up kiln, the wisp of smoke from the flue, the penned-in animals. He laughed. "That little wall won't stop the January wind, Ilara. It'll come through the cracks like 1,000 tiny knives. You'll be eating that dog before Christmas." She paused, leaning on her axe handle, her breath pluming in the air. "This wall has no cracks," she said, and went back to her work. Brant returned to town with his story, embellishing her quiet confidence as the ravings of a madwoman. The Cinder Witch of Northridge was not only foolish, she was proud in her foolishness, which made her eventual, inevitable demise all the more satisfying to contemplate. But as the first snows dusted the peaks, Ilara's life settled into a deep and steady rhythm. Her world was the 20-foot circle of her home and the small orbit of tasks that sustained it. Morning began before sunrise, stoking the fire, feeding Cinder and the chickens, collecting the precious eggs. She would check her snares along the game trails, sometimes finding a rabbit or a grouse. She tended her strange, subterranean garden, where the pale green leaves of kale and chard grew slowly but steadily under the dim light from a tallow lamp. She ground grain for her bread, mended her clothes, sharpened her axe. Outside, the world was turning hostile. The wind howled, and snow began to fall in earnest, piling in drifts against the north side of her home. But inside the kiln, a different reality existed. The temperature hovered in a constant, comfortable range. The deep, earthen warmth radiated from the walls, a silent, tireless furnace. The sound of the wind was a distant murmur, a rumor of a world she no longer inhabited. She was utterly alone, a solitary queen in a kingdom of brick and clay. But she was not helpless. She was warm, she was fed, she was safe. Before the great storm, there were smaller tests. A week of freezing rain encased the entire ridge in a shell of ice. In town, tree branches heavy with ice snapped and crashed onto roofs. But the dome of the kiln, with its curved surface, shed the ice easily. The weight did not trouble it. Later, a pack of hungry wolves, drawn by the scent of her pig, circled her home for 2 nights. Their howls were a chilling symphony just beyond her wall. Boulder stood at the door, a low, rumbling growl in his chest, a formidable guardian. Ilara reinforced the door with a heavy timber bar and kept the fire burning bright. The wolves, unable to find a weakness, eventually moved on. Each trial, each small victory, hardened her resolve and deepened her trust in the systems she had built. The kiln was not just a shelter, it was a fortress. It was a living thing, breathing warmth, providing water, and holding her safe in its earthen heart. Then came the storm that would be known for a generation as the Great Blizzard of '83. It did not arrive like a normal winter storm. It came like an invading army. The sky turned a bruised slate gray, and the air grew heavy and still, a suffocating silence that was more terrifying than any wind. Then the first flakes began to fall, not soft, gentle flakes, but hard, granular pellets of ice that hissed as they hit the ground. Within an hour, the world vanished into a churning, vertical river of white. The wind followed, a physical entity that screamed from the north with the voice of a banshee. It was a wind that didn't go around things. It went through them. It hammered against the walls and roofs of Promise Creek, searching for any crack, any weakness. The temperature plummeted. It dropped past 0, past 10 below, into a realm of cold that was actively hostile to life. It was a cold that broke things. It made iron brittle and wood groan like a dying man. Inside her kiln, Ilara felt the storm's arrival as a change in pressure. The murmur of the wind beyond her walls rose to a deep, resonant roar, the sound of a distant waterfall. But that was all. The temperature inside did not change. The fire in her hearth drew steadily, its flames unwavering. The thick, curved walls, backed by 10 feet of solid earth, were impervious. The storm was a theoretical concept, a noise from a world that could not touch her. She fed her animals, milked her single goat she had acquired from the trapper, and checked on her garden. The kale was crisp and green. Life, warm and ordered, continued unabated. She was an island of calm in a universe of roaring chaos. In Promise Creek, it was a different story. The town was breaking. The green wood many had stockpiled, thinking it would be enough, burned sluggishly, producing more smoke than heat. The fierce wind drove smoke back down chimneys, filling houses with choking soot. The cold was a physical presence, a thief that stole the warmth from every room. Families huddled together under piles of blankets, their breath crystallizing in the air. The windows were opaque sheets of ice. The roof of the livery stable, burdened by 4 feet of heavy, wind-packed snow, collapsed with a sound like a thunderclap, killing half the horses inside. Mr. Gable's Mercantile, the town's proud center, had its great front windows shattered by the force of the wind, and the interior was now a maelstrom of snow and freezing air. Livestock in their barns, thought to be safe, began to die, their bodies freezing solid in the stalls. The town's confidence, its belief in the sturdiness of its own construction, was being systematically dismantled. The people of Promise Creek were learning a terrible lesson. Their homes were just thin wooden boxes, and the wilderness they thought they had tamed was now tearing them apart. The mockery they had heaped on Alara felt like a distant memory from another lifetime. Now there was only the cold, the wind, and the growing, gnawing fear. On the 3rd day of the blizzard, when the wind was at its most ferocious, Alara heard a sound. It was faint, almost lost in the roar, a frantic, rhythmic banging on her door. Boulder heard it too, and erupted in a deep-chested barrage of barks. She quieted him with a hand on his back and listened. It came again, weaker this time. Someone was out there. Someone had managed to fight their way up the ridge in this apocalypse. She barred the door from the inside and pulled on her heaviest coat. Taking a deep breath, she lifted the heavy timber bar and cracked the door open. The wind ripped it from her hand, slamming it wide against the inner wall. A figure, completely encrusted in snow and ice, stumbled forward and collapsed onto the clay floor. It was a man. She dragged him fully inside and managed to force the door shut against the storm's fury, barring it once more. She rolled the figure over. It was Mr. Gable. His face was a mask of frozen agony, his beard a solid chunk of ice. His eyes, wild with terror and desperation, fixed on hers. "My boy," he croaked, his voice a raw whisper. "He's dying. The fever. The house is so cold. We have no more wood." He clutched at her sleeve, his frozen glove making a rasping sound. "Please, Alara. They said you had wood. They said you were warm." Alara looked down at the man who had openly mocked her, who had laughed at her folly. She saw the face of the man who had led the chorus of derision that had followed her out of town. A bitter, cold satisfaction flickered in her heart. He was broken. They were all broken. Their conventional wisdom, their sturdy plank houses, their smug certainty, it had all failed them. And now he was here, begging at the feet of the Cinder Witch. She thought of her firewood, a meticulously stacked cord of seasoned oak and pine, her lifeblood for the rest of the winter. Every log was a product of her own sweat and labor, a guarantee of her own survival. To give it away was to risk her own carefully balanced existence. To help him was to help the town that had cast her out. But then she looked at his face and saw not the smug merchant, but a father terrified for his child. She saw not an enemy, but a human being at the ragged edge of his endurance. The choice was not about justice or revenge. It was simpler than that. A child was cold. She had warmth. The calculation was brutal, but the conclusion was clear. To let him fail now would be to become as cold and unforgiving as the storm itself. She did not deliberate for long. Her brief moment of hesitation passed, replaced by the same grim resolve that had built the wall. She helped Gable to a seat by the fire and gave him a mug of hot broth from the pot that was always simmering. His hands shook so badly he could barely hold it. "Stay here," she commanded. "Get warm." Then she went to work. She pulled on her thickest mittens, wrapped a scarf around her face, and unbarred the door once more. She fought her way out into the lean-to, where she had built a small, sturdy sled for hauling firewood. The wind nearly tore her from her feet. The short distance was a brutal struggle against a solid wall of moving air and stinging ice. She loaded the sled with as much of her precious, seasoned hardwood as it could carry. She added 2 of her thickest wool blankets and another jar of broth, sealed tight. She dragged the sled to the door, the runners grating on the wind-scoured stone. Gable watched her, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and dawning shame. She pushed the sled toward him. "This wood is dry," she said, her voice sharp and clear over the storm. "Use it sparingly. It will burn hotter than what you have. Keep your boy close to the fire. Use the blankets. Go now, before the path you broke is gone." He could only nod, his throat too tight with emotion to speak. He took the rope of the sled, gave her one last look of profound, humbled gratitude, and plunged back into the white fury of the storm. Section. Later that day, as the storm raged on without pause, the banging came again. This time it was Brant, the hunter who had promised she would be eating her dog by Christmas. He was not alone. He was half carrying another man, Silas. Her brother-in-law's fine wool coat was torn, and his face was the color of ash. His family, he stammered, was freezing. The chimney in his big, impressive house was blocked with ice, and the main room was filling with smoke. They had nowhere to go. Gable, his own son, now stable and warm, thanks to Alara's wood, had told them to come here. It was the only place. The Cinder Witch, Brant had said to the huddle of desperate townsfolk in the half-frozen church. She was right. It's warm up there, like summer. Alara let them in. She let in Silas, his wife, and their 2 pale, shivering children. She looked at the man who had taken everything from her, who had left her for dead, and she felt nothing. The anger and bitterness had been burned out of her by labor and solitude. There was only the immediate, practical problem. People were cold, and she had warmth. "There is stew," she said, pointing to the pot. "The children can sleep by the hearth." Silas stared, his mouth agape. He took in the scene that had so stunned Gable. The warm, dry air. The soft glow of the firelight on the curved brick walls. The impossible sight of green plants growing in their beds against the far wall. The contented clucking of chickens from behind their small door. The cistern of clear, life-giving water. He was standing inside the worthless, broken-down kiln he had given her as a final insult, and it was the safest, warmest, most alive place on earth. His eyes met hers. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, devastating shame. He, the master of Promise Creek, the man of finance and clever contracts, was a refugee. She, the madwoman, the pitiable fool, was a queen in her fortress. "We were wrong, Alara," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. His wife began to cry silently. "My God, we called you a fool. We were the fools." Alara simply nodded and ladled stew into bowls for his children. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not demand an apology or a reckoning. Her victory was not in their humiliation, but in the simple, irrefutable fact of her survival. She had built a world that worked, and now her world was saving theirs. She moved with a quiet, efficient grace, offering blankets, food, a place by the fire. Her actions spoke louder than any words of triumph could. Her generosity in that moment was more absolute and more cutting than any revenge. She was not just a survivor, she was a leader. Her authority derived not from wealth or status, but from the profound competence of her own two hands. When the blizzard finally broke after 5 days, it revealed a world transformed. Promise Creek was shattered, buried under monolithic drifts of snow, a landscape of broken roofs and frozen silence. The town had survived, but only just. The stories of who had frozen and who had been saved all led back to the same place, the old kiln on North Ridge. In the weeks that followed, a steady stream of visitors made the trek up the hill. They came not with pity or mockery, but with a quiet, humbled reverence. They brought gifts, a side of bacon, a bag of sugar, a bolt of cloth. But mostly, they came for knowledge. They asked to see her mortar mix, to understand the principles of her chimney, to study the way she had sealed her door against the wind. They looked at the thermal mass of the earth and brick with new eyes. The nickname Cinder Witch was never spoken again. Some started calling her Ilara of the Ridge. Others went back to the old name, the Kiln Wife. But now it was said with the deepest respect, as if it were a title of nobility. Silas, stripped of his authority by his own colossal failure of foresight, sold his holdings and moved east with his family, unable to live with the shame. The power structure of Promise Creek had been broken by the cold, and was now being rebuilt around a new, quieter center of gravity. The changes were slow, but profound. When the town rebuilt, it built differently. New homes were dug into hillsides, their foundations made of stone, their walls thicker. People began to stockpile seasoned hardwood, not green pine. They learned to respect the wind and the cold, not as enemies to be conquered, but as forces to be understood and accommodated. Ilara's folly became the blueprint. Her home, once a symbol of madness, was now a landmark, a testament to a different, more resilient kind of wisdom. Her story was told and retold, traveling with trappers and merchants to other valleys, becoming a quiet legend of the frontier. Ilara lived on North Ridge for the rest of her days. She never remarried, never moved back to the valley. Her world remained the warm, living circle of the kiln, her garden, her animals. She traded her surplus eggs and vegetables for the few things she couldn't make herself, but she needed little. She had built more than a shelter. She had built a life, on her own terms, from the things others had thrown away. Years later, an old woman with skin like tanned leather and eyes as clear as the water in her cistern, she would sit on the bench outside her door on a summer evening. She would watch the lights of the new, smarter, sturdier Promise Creek twinkle in the valley below. She had never asked for their respect, never sought their apologies. She had only refused to be broken. In the end, her legacy was not in the bricks she had laid or the systems she had engineered. It was in the quiet, unshakable truth that the greatest strength is not the power to dominate the world, but the wisdom to find your place within it and to build a warmth that can outlast any storm.